Book 2 of the Gigantean Mysterian series, The MiniMansioneerers and the Emerging Humanoids. Young Jaden Marshall had lived in a small, subdivided room on the 3rd floor, under the ground level. He had been moved to the recycling quarters of that floor that provided a small yet adequate room for him to rest, to wash, to cook, to clean, and to take care of himself. There were few miles of corridors that were all occupied, or mostly occupied with the nearby recycling workers who worked at the nearby recycling facilities at the local plant. But it was over half a mile of corridors, walk, stagger, ramble, or sometimes even march away. A long, long distance from his room, round the long winding corridors. He didn't see many of his fellow recyclers out of the workplace. Had only done it for a few years though, just a couple. Had not been in any social work, not for a long time. Not really been going to any social gatherings, not for a few years. So it didn't matter that the small 3 lounges on his particular floor of the mega mansion, that they were all cramped, taken over, hoarded up with people in different corners, that it was just far too busy to get into for most of the time. There were rare occasions when it freed up some of the spaces during the lonely ghost hours in the later parts of the night. But even those occasions of freer spaces in those public lounges were rarer. He'd gotten used to just living and resting, mostly at home, in his own small, contained room. In time, he wasn't at work. He was mostly up ascending out of the ground level, travelling and visiting other floors within the mega mansion. There were vast many different floors that he could travel to. Although there were many floors that could not be travelled to, or that you had to have special permission, a qualification, some training, and some completion of various tests. But there were many other floors also that were also open to the general public as well, without any admittance tests needed. And he was able to go out like a tourist to visit many of the different lounges. He visited many of the larger public lounges high up in the building. Yet he couldn't afford to elevate too often, only for special occasions really. To visit his distant high-up family for those occasional visits. One of his aunts long ago had retired, elevating high up in the building, up to level apartment 90. Her apartment was 90 up from the ground level. Although small, and having an out-facing window with magnificent views to look out at. He loved just to go up and see the views alone, even if he found her, the aunt, a little old-fashioned, and struggled to curb his blunt corridor talk whilst he was around her. And he found her a little meandering in her thoughts, rambling, too going off on wild tangents. And even when she didn't, she was still quite conservative. He found her too prudish, a little judgmental in raising her eyebrows one too many times, merely banning any thought of sexuality whilst around her. She was kind to him and generous, and patient sometimes too. She'd send him lots of encouraging letters and lots of long rambled, encouraging pictures too, and occasionally even small parcels of food that were sent as also. Yet he felt that he could only visit occasionally, really, as he couldn't really be as open with her as he'd like to have been, as he was with his mum, the aunt's sister, many years earlier. Couldn't be open about his deeper, rawer, emotional frustrations that had been building up and gradually emerging more over the last few years. He'd been much more open and much more sympathetic with other women and found their aunt so hard and awkward to get on with, really. And the mother too. He could talk to her very openly about a whole wide range of different issues, even about the personal relationships. He'd never done any megaloping himself, never left the mega mansion, had remained in the familiar mega mansion even when many of his family had long ago moved on, emigrated out, megaloped to off other towers, to other megalopian towers they travelled to, often living and emigrating or elevating upwards to different floors of the mega mansion itself. People move floors a lot these days, elevating up or down much more than they ever did in the past. A lot more now. The speed that people elevated and changed floors had grown much over the decades. That itself had grown exponentially. You could live and work in one room of one floor all of your life in the ancient past. That's how things were. People were of one room, one corridor, and one floor. But now people changed rooms and then changed corridors, swapped corridors for far flung distant corridors sometimes, and even swapped floors often too now. Some people did at least. You'd fall in love with someone from a completely different floor that had elevated down for a visit to some family members, and then find yourself moving with them back to that floor somehow. If the relationship worked out, you may descend or ascend to live with them or to visit them regularly, perhaps. People would change floors when they found new jobs sometimes, and the job would require them to live in an accommodation closer to the work, or closer to a training place, perhaps, for schooling. Lots of people would change their rooms, of course. That was much more common. Many times it happened. Many times throughout their life. Sometimes dozens and dozens was common with people. And even some, in just a year or so, could change the room itself dozens of times. So it was very common that people could have moved a lot, changing corridors and floors often too, and lived for a long time in many different floors of the home. Many were required to travel throughout the home to visit many of the different floors within the building, travelling often and resting, working in different floors, even if they predominantly only rested within only a few of the homely floors in particular. Being on one of the ground workers, his father being a forager long ago, their family floor was on the complex on the lower level. They'd always lived nearer the grounder floors because they'd worked outside for ease of use. That's before the large ladders were introduced on the outside. And then, of course, the great helter-skelter winding round the outside of the building from the up deck. Those things hadn't been introduced until years later. So his family had always been situated in the lower floors for ease of use towards the ground level. His father still had found work travelling out of the building when people had worked out back then, travelling out from the mega mansion with all of the rest of them, the rest of the labouring group traipsing along, wet or rain or sunshine either, whatever the weather, trudging out towards the old train tracks, training out to their patch of the woods to collect their specific leaves, their seeds, the bark, the fungi, and all the other foraged goods, according to the ordered requests they'd received. In his old adolescent days, long ago, young Jaden had traipsed out with the father himself, and with a few uncles and their family friends too, older men that all worked in the labouring, foraging jobs together. In good or bad weather, moody or happy spirits, joining the other garagers, the foragers had all stumped out together. Working for many summers, he'd worked collecting the foraged goods, doing a little foraging here and there in the patched scrub of forest land, the parts that still offered up fruits to yield in good numbers. Also before, gradually, he'd just been travelling out with gangs of farm labourers in years later, where he would pick vegetables and fruits, doing a little harvesting with the machines and the other labourers too, when there were jobs like that. He went out to do farm picking and orchard gathering too, where he'd continued harvesting seasonally for many years, well into his 20s, not just doing the seasonal summer work, but it extended all the way from early spring to late autumn too, with only winters off. For many years, forging and foraging into his mid-20s, until the work would slowly dwindle away as the machines gradually took over many more of the labouring jobs. Even though he eventually had to abandon his earlier foraging work with his foraging family and father, he wasn't as quick nor knowledgeable as them. No, not by a long way, compared to his father's specialised knowledge, having worked at it as a professional with his uncle and grandfather, trained with it as a family together. They were all professional foragers, had done so for many decades. Even with their skills and expertise and their committed work, That was no longer necessary. Even they were struggling to find the work, with so many machines being able to sniff out, find, collect, and store all of the foraged goods much easier than people ever could now. And besides, many of those things were grown in the lab back at home, in their own ways. And eventually, even the fruits and the vegetables gathered out in the farms that Jaden had traipsed off, travelling up to, even that work had gradually dwindled eventually. They also had larger machinery eventually installed to assist the harvesters and eventually taking over much of the harvesting work. So there was much less demand for outside work, either for the forestry work in the foraging and gathering of the seeds and herbs, or of the farm work. He'd stayed on in the family floors, nevertheless, even though there wasn't the family work outside anymore. One that they'd lived in for some years. They'd lived in that particular family room. It was a very large family apartment with multiple rooms within it, some that had doors and others that didn't have any at all. Although Jaden had moved out of the family room itself, living a quarter of a mile corridor ramble down from his parents' room, and allowing their mother's sister, one of the aunties, to move into his old room, as of course the regulations dictated that someone had to, and the aunt was just closer to the family, and the mother especially, so that she could then care for the sister, who was getting older and had her own issues, and to help her much more to nurse her own husband, to help nurse him through a serious illness that he had eventually passed on from when Jaden lost his father. He'd acquired so many injuries over the number of decades, repetitive strain injuries, some that had gotten worse and later infected, multiplying, snowballing, until it became overwhelming and too much for both Jaden and the mother, and the aunt had moved in as a temporary carer to assist them both. In the decades of work, Jaden's father had struggled much. Physically and mentally, the work had been challenging for him. 50 years of that had taken its toll on him. Had become much more frail after a number of different falls then in his 60s, as he'd given birth at an older age, conceiving of Jaden when he was middle-aged himself. Jaden was at least close to his mother, though, and close to the auntie's room also, even when he corridor loped a few years later. To support them through the grief, he was still able to visit half corridor down the road, and be used to going on the shopping trips for them, because they found the shopping carts too heavy to push along back and forth, up and down the long, sloping, winding corridors. That was difficult to do, really, especially with the sheer amount that was needed for the both of them and the aunt's young children, Jaden's nephews and nieces. She had a couple of them. They both had a lot of needs and a lot of shopping too, so it was a really heavy cart to push up the sloping corridors. He'd been a shy, introverted youth, was often awkward in his social situations, like he just didn't know how to react to so many people in unsure, unknown situations, with people that were strange, or in people that were familiar to him, but in strange situations themselves, where he could often then misread a lot of social cues, would often laugh at something that was actually meant to be serious, or he would mistake the humour for just sarcasm, or he would think that someone was just joking that actually was trying to be serious. He took everything people said quite literally, was really a literalist on too many things. He would often try and make sarcastic jokes to strangers and even acquaintances, though he didn't know them, yet they would think he was trying to be too serious, since he didn't always smile or laugh, obviously, at his own jokes, if he'd already heard them or told them many times before, but still thought they were funny for others to hear them, especially those that hadn't heard them before. He was honest, up to a degree, mostly honest. Maybe he was too honest sometimes, just too much. Said whatever he thought without thinking enough, didn't bite his tongue enough, blurted out rude or hurtful things sometimes, often with new people, when he really wasn't familiar with their sensitivities, with their situations, with their emotional abilities either. Although he was often quite apologetic afterwards, if he really discovered that he had actually offended someone, because he didn't always know. Yet his habit of just blurting things out, whether sometimes in anger, sometimes in lust, and sometimes in love, and sometimes just thoughtlessly, just in the passion of the moment, in an excitement, in a debate. Often it got him into trouble, though. He suspected it was the cause, perhaps, of many relationship issues. A few relationships had become somewhat estranged, quite distant, a few of them over the years, or at least it perhaps could have been a contributing factor, if not the sole cause, he considered. He'd had a great many passing acquaintances over the years, a conveyor belt, people he got on with reasonably well, okay, usually just colleagues that he could work with well, just occasional shop talk, but mostly just having a casual chat. Since they were engaged, focused mostly on the work then, taking the focus off themselves so much, so that they weren't really talking in depth, especially. Yet the chats in the staff room sometimes had strayed off into other more personal conversations that sometimes had become awkward. Sometimes things were left unsaid, missing altogether. Large gaps where he wasn't sure what to say and seemed to juggle different potential things before the other person carried on, saying and moving the conversation on, so that finally the conversation, the choice that he'd made to say something, was no longer relevant. And he didn't feel that he could just turn up at a casual acquaintance's private room, even though he had a lot of casual attachments to a variety of casual acquaintances. He didn't feel he could really open up and unburden himself to other people he didn't know that well. He would travel back for years to the old family corridors, the old family floor, especially whilst his mother had still lived on there for some years after the father's death. Yet over the years, many of the friendlier rooms of that family corridor had slowly, gradually become more and more estranged, as many had now moved on to different corridors of the wing, or moving on to different wings of different floors, and different floors within the complex itself, and many others had even migrated on to different complexes, megaloping out of the mega mansion itself. Over the years of visiting his mother many times, and her friends too, visiting the mother's room and the mother's friends' rooms, so many friends of his had also moved on, and so many of his mother's friends too, that he'd lost that connection to the family floor and the family corridor and to all those once family rooms, so that eventually there were few left at the old family corridor, that family corridor of rooms that had once been a big part of his family life, for a whole chapter, for a decade and a half. He'd gone into doing office work after that, secretarial, administrative, computer assistant work, data gathering, where he worked to gather a mass of data, uploading it all into a giant machine, requesting loads of information, questionnaires of information, collecting bundles of paperwork, going through telephonic conversations with people, collecting their responses to a whole variety of questions. He'd worked for the accommodation agencies, who tried to keep the records of the many different room swaps and the room trades that there were within the apartments, the mega mansions. The residents were required to register to the officers and they also could seek assistance as well from the office staff too, to help find a suitable placement, a suitable room swap, so that it was a room that was a suitable size, style, a suitable kind of area to live in as well, so that the assistants could look through a whole range of adverts to help those that wished to trade rooms. His role was really only trying to give advice on that, and to give out as much of neutral information as possible, to assist those also that were struggling to find a good swap and to actually work the information themselves, who had also sometimes emerging, more urgent needs that he would have to help more. He found it interesting work. Sometimes, of course, it was a little tedious, repetitive. Yet he liked that it was trying to give people an assistance still, caring for people, even in a very small way. Even if it only was ever really a minority that really found the ideal swap. Many had to compromise, of course. Everyone did a little, but some people had to a lot. Perhaps on the size or the condition of the room, or sometimes even the location, if it was just the right size and had all the right functional abilities and everything else within it. Even so, he tried to find a reasonably okay room for people, And some people did find that sometimes he could spend an hour or so just giving someone advice on things, just considering a small handful of rooms. So giving details of multiple possible future homes, multiple possible futures for them to consider, only for none of them to be suitable, however, frustratingly. And they'd have to search more and more, taking many more hours indeed. Sometimes it could be dozens of hours just spent on someone that had urgent, really difficult to find needs. And trying to find the time to do that, they'd have to call back multiple times, so that it could last many months sometimes. You'd have the same person you talk to quite regularly, but there was a time limit of how often you could spend assisting them to find the ideal homes, or anything that was reasonable. There were frustrations that were sometimes vented out against him, and the other customer assistants too, at the telephonic offices. And the programs that he used, those were often vented out against. Those were often the cause, partly, of the frustrations. Those programs that he was uploading the information in, for failing to match the ideal room enough of the time, or anything even close sometimes. Yet most of the people were understanding about that, and patient up to a point. It was rare that they ever really were that annoyed with Jaden himself, or any of the other customer assistants. Not as a regular thing, only rare and exceptional. He was usually quite polite and considered himself whilst working on the telephone with them. Usually it was just the inefficiency of the room swapping services, the long delays, the outdated programs that often needed some updating. That was the cause of some of the frustrations anyway. He'd enjoyed much about the customer service telephonic work, and felt quite happy when some of the people had at least been able to be placed in some more suitable rooms than they had been in previously. He was a thin, tall, pale-faced man, who, like many others, didn't really go out in the sun that often. He hardly went out much at all now. There really wasn't that much need for MiniMansioneerers to go out that often. Hardly at all. He worked inside most of the time. He slept inside, studied inside, partied inside, did everything inside, really. And even did his physical exercises now, his jogging around inside as well. On his days off, casually lagging around as a tourist, he'd be sauntering up and down the long, winding corridors within the mega mansions, travelling and visiting the various floors, those that he was able to elevate towards. On happier occasions, he'd be touristing around the inner workings of the mega mansion itself, so vast that it could accommodate many months of travel. Or sometimes he'd just be staggering and stumbling around, drunk, weary, or sometimes marching through the corridors when he was late, rushing to work, or going towards one of the public resting areas. Usually, he was trying to get there to get a seat because it was so cramped sometimes. He even used to go jogging sometimes. Sometimes he'd given up doing that when the work had become more physical the last couple of years, because he didn't need to do the additional physical training with the really demanding physical exercise that the recycling work was. But he used to go jogging around some of the upper floor corridors. Some of the wilder corridors, there were a couple up there, visiting the upper levels. A couple were dedicated to various researchers and people that were doing physical exercises too. When you could run around doing circuits of the outside within the building, the outside rooms that faced the outside, the exterior, so that they could look out at the scenery from all different sides of the building, running around the building, looking at the view around them, getting to see at pace the swirl of the scenery outside. As there were few jogging lanes that ran around the inside of the long stretched out glass walls. And there were long lanes for different speeds that people could travel at and along those wide corridors on the edge of the building. He preferred to jog on the outside when the weather was fairly good, because it was often ventilated and a good breath of fresh air. Before twilight or after sunrise, sometimes he used to go running out on the lawns before it got too overcrowded and there were too many over-regulations. He'd go out many years ago. He used to go out running and dancing around out on the lawns sometimes. He'd been running around doing circuits of the entire mega mansion. That was many, many miles, though, doing his circuits around the lawns. The lawns swept all around the building itself, making a huge, vast circle around the building. He would be running around, surrounding the complex. He had only done the running alone himself when he used to do it. He'd not really joined a running group, especially. He'd like to go at his own pace, to stop, have a look at the flowers, if the desire took him, stop and inspect some clouds, look at an architectural feature at the side of the building, some bushes or trees that were there, or just look at some squirrels jumping from a branch, or a bird singing in a tree, or anything that took his fancy, something that aroused his curiosity. Maybe he'd stop to look at some of the dogs running around, or different people performing their shows out on the stretch of lawns, out of curiosity. Alone, he could stop where and whenever he wanted to. As often, he was intrigued by passing things he saw. He would stop alongside other strangers sometimes to get his breath back from the long jogging, sometimes to stop and watch a sports game being played out, or some show that the other spectators were joining in watching. The telephonic, secretarial, and administrative office work had given him a real function, something that he liked and enjoyed doing to an extent, for at least some of the time, much of the time. It provided also a good mental, ideological challenge. It encouraged him and forced him to really think about a lot of things. It was a real challenge to actually engage and speak to other people, and to adjust his ideas and his thoughts according to their needs, and the workplace programs too. He would occasionally visit a friend's back then, who'd moved to a distant floor, one that he had to pay to get to elevate himself to sometimes, but he could afford to visit sometimes. Or he would still back then visit his mother sometimes, and their mutual friends occasionally, before they'd passed on too. Yet when so many had moved on, and with it being so hard to travel that far, he'd been trying to keep himself as physically active, doing the jogging, and then moving on to the physically demanding recycling work at the recycling warehouse floor. Trying to really improve his physical strength, because he'd been in an office lacking any physical training for years on end, had felt he'd really gotten out of shape. After the many years sat at a desk with repetitive strain injuries, his back aching, and with a little weight around his mid-waist, sat slumped in front of the computer. He felt a little overweight, had a little beer belly now, so it looked like he was only a couple of months pregnant, perhaps 1 or 2. So he'd like to have a tummy tucker, to wear it to force it inside, something to conceal the little weight he'd put on. He'd forced himself to do more and more of the physical exercises, ascending and descending the many stairways that there were throughout the building, going up and down the stairwells. When he had the time to do that was, in visiting the other floors. He could do thousands of steps up and down to get to see all the other people on the different floors, passing up and down. He would enjoy doing it because it was such a wide, giant staircase that could accommodate and fit vast numbers, jogging, walking, stepping, climbing, up and down. Vast numbers travelled up and down them. The giant flights of stairs within the building, where you could even stop to rest on a chair at mid-flights. There were mid-sections where the stairways broke up. Usually you could stop there was a resting area where there would be a clutter of different chairs and tables. People would usually sit down for rest, just momentarily, usually to exchange a smile, a nod, a greeting to strangers. He discovered that hanging out alongside the small areas, that you could actually sit and watch people moving, climbing, and watch them travelling, and that was also nice too. And on the staircases, there were all these different pictures up and down the walls, on the sides of the stairs. High up, if you crooked your neck up high. He loved to look at the different pictures hanging up all alongside the wall of the long, winding staircases. All different pictures of different eras, different styles, from so many different ages. They aged as you got more higher up the stairwells. It was always nice to climb up and down and have a look at the different stair pictures that one hadn't seen for a long time, to climb up an old staircase that one hadn't visited in so long. There were a large number of the different staircases that one could ascend or descend, and he rotated the different ones according to those that he preferred to do regularly, and occasionally there were ones that changed their stair pictures often, that he liked to revisit to see the new stair styles that they might have. He liked to really climb up as well, because he felt it was good for his ankles, for his calf muscles. So it was good training physically, as well as having some mental and social intrigue in it too. He got to see so many of the changing stairways, the stair pictures, the stair people, and it was really interesting for him. Some people had done challenges, races to try and ascend and descend every stairway in as quick a time as possible, or then having to answer questions about the stair pictures and the stair people, and to absorb as much of the information, the stair information they'd be quizzed on later, after they'd done the stair races, that was. No, Jaden didn't like to take part in the stair competitions too much, though. No, he only went up for doing casual stair chats or casual stair exercises, really. Wasn't into any of the stair challenges particularly. He just liked to do it in his own way, and didn't really do it too competitively. Wasn't a great athlete in it. He never really got out of breath doing his ascending or descending up and down the staircases. The changes of jobs were good for him, good for his physical training, as it meant that he went on to more focusing on physical rather than just emotional and mental training. It was heavier work at the recycling factory, unloading lorries of the large cages that had been driven with them inside. Many cages were stacked inside the lorries themselves. They were driven down into the lower recycling facility. There were roads that went down under into the earth, under the lawn surrounding the building, and into one of the colossal building's entrances. A number of roads passed under those lawns, so that the lawns themselves were freed up from any traffic. There was no issue with air pollution there whatsoever, because the underroad would only emerge a long distance way out from the actual building itself, far out, with the traffic passing down under into a sloping tunnel some distance away that would slope long and down, and that led into various lower level chambers, underground floors. They were known commonly as the underroads, the underfoot traffic, the underpaths, if it was just a pathway, of course. Therefore they caused no problem to above ground pedestrians, or the visitors, the grounded people above ground. Caused them no accidents whatsoever. There were no stray pedestrians colliding with cars, or cars colliding with each other. Nor no air pollution either. Walking to the grounds nearby to the complex, some also called the wormholes, the deep underground holes that had been dug out. Not just the underroads and the underpaths, but those smaller, dingier, deeper, dungier little holes that you had to crawl through. Though those little wormholes, that was more a reference to the underground paths, the smaller ones from old smugglers' caves, storage units, and workmen's maintenance workers. Plumbers had used those shafts, as had electricians too, and computer installers had had to use the maintenance shafts too, those that hadn't been sealed up long ago. Those little holes, potholes really, buried deep under the actual foundations of the building, led deep under and out. Just little crawly tunnels to crawl through. Many of those weren't really big enough to walk through, especially. There were ones that you had to bend down, crouch down low and crawl under. And eventually they sloped under and outwards to emerge out at some other point, where perhaps a transport terminal would be waiting there, where all the other underpaths and the underroads would exit somewhere out, far away from the building itself, exiting out often at various other transport terminals. They could be located in a whole variety of different places, outside and far away from the actual building and the building's grounds surrounding it. Other of the exits, the underpath and the underroad, they had emerged far away, far away, closer to workplaces. And others that had once emerged were now closed down because they had later dilapidated, fallen apart into ruinous condition. and there'd been no desire or need for them to be upkept. Old train stations that were now converted into new tourist shops, cafes, even museums, and green corridors that had once been railway tracks. A number of underpaths were also now closed because there'd been rock slides, mud slides, and there was the fear that they were perhaps not so safe to travel through unless there was further maintenance work done out on them. Every day, young Jaden and the other recycling workers, they unloaded the vans that were packed full of the metallic cages, stuffed full of them, dozens and dozens, sometimes 40 or 50 cages, rammed in and tied together within the larger lorry. They had to empty all of the large cages, rolling them out down the ramp gradually, emptying all the cages of their stuffed-in plastic and cardboard, the recycling material, from the produce that was already earlier sold. Often with a great effort, heaving and pushing out the crammed-in packaging onto a down-below conveyor belt that was always whooshing along at great speed. For the packaging, the different packaging, to be crushed up and then sent off elsewhere for further recycling. Then there were all the empty cages, now that were emptied out, to then take back and stack away, that then had to be restocked into the lorries itself and tied safely back in, securely. He got the occasional bruise, an arm, a calf ached quite often, as often happened to all of the workers there, of course. Yet he'd never really seen any serious incident in all the years he'd worked there, and no one had really fallen into the conveyor belt of the crushing machine. Nothing like that, fortunately, had ever happened. No, he'd never noticed any serious incidents. No one falling into the crushing machine, thankfully. Many had had a small bruise now and again, being knocked by one of the cages pushing into them, but never at great speed either, because the actual cages themselves were so heavy themselves, and sometimes you expected to pull a couple of them along, and they'd be weighted down with the crammed-in packaging, whether it was heavy cardboard or metallic that was even heavier. One could only manage to heave along one of those, potentially. So if one of them actually hit you, it wasn't often a very bad collision, because they were never pulled at great speed anyway. They often went very slow. The smell at the recycling warehouse was especially bad, really. It had that long, malingering odour of old food. Awful. Kind of rotten food, as if there were little bits here and there that just couldn't be cleaned because the warehouse was so big and there was so much old food constantly being thrown around the place on the conveyor belt of old food packaging. They just couldn't be kept clean all the time. It had an old, faint, damp, dusty, mucky, murky smell about it too. Still, there were the large, giant doors through which the lorries would deliver their empty packaging, and when they weren't there, that left large gaps through which there could be a large amount of ventilation, and the air often wafted in with wafts of the fresh air, cleansing out the dirty smells. And as he'd learnt from his time working in the toilet cleaning long ago, and doing home care work, cleaning in the past, you could sometimes put something pungent under your nose. He'd used the rub of eucalyptus oil, smudging it just under the nostrils, so that it would take the edge off the foul smells around the recycling dirt factory. Still, it was nothing compared to the sewer workers, and some plumbers too, what they had to tolerate in the nostrils, and the masks they were forced to wear, and other things to try and dampen out the smell. Even from his own work with the toilet cleaners, they'd had to tolerate worse smells than at the recycling factory, although those were only brief and occasional. Perhaps losing your sense of smell had its upside in some professions, in some occupancies. Still, you wouldn't want to miss the sweet fragrance of a sweetly scented flower, though. And it was worth tolerating some foul smells for that. Jaden had lived a more solitary lifestyle since changing his jobs, rooms, and also floor a couple of years ago, going on long rambled solo tours of the complex, of the mega mansions, or even just tagging along sometimes with a touring group, pretending to be one of them, listening in nearby, if it was a group touring that he could easily merge into. If they were a large enough group, and wouldn't really notice. And he could be mixed in enough with them. He could hardly follow a children's or women's group or an elderly tour, and wouldn't really want to in any case. Wouldn't want to go at the pace of the elderly or of the children in any case. He also had friends he could remotely message also. They lived on many different floors that were inaccessible. They were difficult to elevate towards because of the costs and because he wasn't qualified to do so. But he was still able to message some of them and for them to message him too. He was messaged by a great many who he also messaged too, from many different parts of Megalopia. A sibling of a different building, children of different giant towers perhaps, but still residents of Megalopian, and the Gigantia Mysteria residents. He spoke occasionally to those on distant, unreachable floors that could never be visited, and those in distant, remote parts of the island itself, the island of Gigantia Mysteria, another who'd gone Megalopian. Yet he did not go out often to physically see people, socially in person, not anymore, not for the last few years. Only occasionally. And even then, that was mostly just to visit the retired aunt who'd elevated up north years ago, who he had to elevate up occasionally to visit, who he continued to maintain strained relationships with, and a few other past friends who were often busy themselves with work, family, some had some illnesses, and were in older, frail health too, unable to invite him or to travel themselves to visit. About a third of his older friends from long, long ago had now also passed on, either through illness, a couple through some kind of accident or incident, and some of the others he just really wasn't sure about, knew nothing about where they were, had just totally lost contact with a few of them, and a few that he'd been very close to. Over half lived further away now, had migrated elsewhere on the island of Gigantia. They had megaloped off to somewhere that he knew, and some of them had megaloped to mysterious places, he knew not where now. It wasn't uncommon at all now, though. In many ways, since mostly people did move on much more today than they ever did before. And to further away, remoter locations too. Many middle-aged people had lost contact with a lot of people in their life, a lot of their friends, family and acquaintances, over the many decades, as the decades wore on. He was glad to have kept in contact with a number of people over the long years. Yet since his own parents' passing, especially his mother's of late, and the passing of a few of the closer friends, friends of the family, friends of the mother, and his own friends too, those that had passed on or moved on, he had now become much more reclusive, going out just for the essential shopping, and his recycling work that he'd still done, and his physical exercises when he could too. Especially more so since getting an additional injury that had gotten worse over time. Then he'd later felt hemmed in, unsure where to go then, or what he could still do now with his changing injuries when the injuries had later progressed. In his poorer condition, that had caused him more pains and strains, and so had distracted him further from his abilities to focus on going out and socially engaging well with many other people. Something that he'd always struggled on before, even without the grief, even without the loneliness and the sickness that had developed now. Yet much more now, with that grief and sickness and the advancing injuries. He was confined to the rest at his own home for a much longer time than he'd ever thought, confined to rest at home until the injuries had properly healed themselves, if they ever would. He wasn't sure, since the injuries had actually gotten much worse. He had his doubts if it would ever recover really. So he had to spend a lot of time now resting, or doing various gentle exercises within the room itself, in his small room that was still accommodating, spending a lot of the time drawing, writing, reading, watching documentaries, whilst he'd recovered to return to his recycling work again at another time. It was an awfully lot of time over the many months of the injury that he'd found to be alone, where he had much more time now to question himself, to search for himself, to debate himself, to debate the dilemmas that he'd faced in his life with himself, not just with others now. He spent a lot of his time trying now to understand himself. Now that he'd had so much time, he'd been forced to be alone with himself so much, as well as trying to understand his own past relationships with others and with the world. He missed and he craved for emotional and physical intimacies. Being alone so often, too often in his room, even the small banter with colleagues occasionally, when he'd been able to work, before the injuries had progressed too far. He greatly missed even those, the small chats of banter occasionally. He'd become especially nostalgic, though, about the past close friendships from long ago. Thinking and writing, meditating much about personal relationships of the past, friendly relationships, family relationships, and romantic relationships too. From so long ago, though, it had taken him so long to really think and to know what those were, and to remember them all well. He still had some friends that he was in contact with occasionally, yet not in a mutually close, intimate relationship, neither physically nor emotionally. Hadn't been in one truly for a couple of years. And the few others had been together a long, long time ago. He'd been with them, many a decade ago, a decade and a half it was. A very long time ago it felt. He'd spent a decade and a half alone. So in a way he was really used to it. He'd had much more time to distract himself from the lack of romances in the past, when he'd had his family, and especially his mother, to be close to. He was especially close to her, and a couple of the aunts too, and also some other friends that he was very close to, that provided a perfect distraction from the lack of romance, all the work, the friendships, the family. And there'd been whatever jobs that he was doing, a constant stream of different jobs, always changing his work every few years. And his friends that hadn't moved on. Now he didn't have those. His aloneness was much more present, and he felt it much more. Perhaps being in so much pain and discomfort with the advancing, progressing injury that had also worsened. He also then wanted that comfort and companionship to resolve his own issues, to support him. Any companionship that could bring him some support. He equally felt embarrassed, though, that anyone should see him in such a poor condition, so weak and feeble, so struggling, in so much pain, crying, and so emotionally, so angry, so depressed, feeling so ashamed with it sometimes. Yet he felt a strong desire also for that pleasure of intimacy as well as the fear of what others will think of him in his own condition, and the fear that the pain could be made worsened by physical contact too, as well as alleviated and comforted from it as well. There was also the shame he felt about what had happened to his body, the fact that since the injury had progressed, it was no longer working, it wasn't progressing, and it wasn't functioning properly anymore. It wasn't working for him or others, as it had done in all the other jobs and relationships, for most of his lifetime, for many years, until he got that serious injury, and then later it had progressed and gotten worse and worse. And his days of working with others, and his nights of having fun and love with others, and resting with others, was then over and gone for a long time. Until now, until he was searching and hoping and dreaming and praying and thinking and wishing that it could be again. He was an odd man in his movements. He was always twitching, tweaking, twerking, making strange movements, pushing his neck. He pushed his neck to one side and then the other, edgily moving it around, awkwardly, in different times. If it hadn't been attached properly or something, it was as if he was trying to screw it back in or hold it and support it up, as if it was too big for him. And often, when feeling a burst of energy, somehow within him, he would move his hands in a weird way to try and relieve that energy and relieve himself of the strain that he'd felt. He stretched back and out the fingers of both of the hands, He would also twitch his eyes and nose, as well as the neck itself also, and sometimes doing the hand stretching in a weird way too. Although he had been able to limit some of those over the years. In many places, he had stopped all the stimmings altogether, and limited them severely in many places. Yet he would return to those old awkward movements, to the movements that others found strange. The habits when he was in stranger circumstances, when he'd lost focus and did something to reassure himself. He also stood in odd postures sometimes, not knowing where to place his long arms dangling low at his sides, trying out many different awkward positions, unsure quite how to stand, trying to figure out or find a comfortable position, always adjusting himself constantly, fidgeting about. He just never could really just stand still at the queue in the shop unless he was really focusing on doing something in particular, reading the phone or looking at a particular product he was pretending to buy, scanning the room, looking out of a window at a view, trying to focus on something, yet not lingering on anybody's face in the queue or other shoppers for too long. Made an act in the shops of appearing to even study some products nearer to him, as if he really wanted to buy those, just taking a passing interest, because it was something just to look at, whilst waiting to still pay. Especially important to occupy your thoughts with some small action, when feeling really hyper-emotional, over-emotional, not wanting to appear out in public as being overly upset, or letting strangers see you crying if you really felt particularly depressed and sad and in a lot of grief that day. Didn't want to appear as a sad person in a shop, really, or even appear as an angry person to strangers, having to try and hem in and curb all the sadness and the anger. Nor did he want the strangers to see him in a bewildered, confused state. He tried to appear as a happy, content, self-assured shopper while he was out in the different shops, not wanting to be a sad shopper, an angry shopper, or even to be a weird or confused shopper. Just wanting to be another happy, relatively content, casual, self-assured shopper, out there with strangers doing the same thing, rationalizing that they wouldn't know the reasons for his grief, his anger, or for his confusions anyway. They wouldn't know the reasons for his uncertainties. So it was the fear of appearing emotionally neurotic to other people, of appearing overly emotional to strangers that wouldn't know the reasons for that emotional surge. That led him to being quite restrained and controlling in his various temperaments, in better times when he was able to. When happier, when generally happy, and genuinely so, it was much easier then, when out and about in a public shop perhaps, to then strike up a conversation, exchange a pleasant greeting perhaps, or even a little joke with others. If he was in a genuinely happy mood, he could do that. But it was quite hard if you were really actually going through a genuine grief, or feeling really genuinely angry about something and upset with others, and really concerned and confused about really what's going on. And when that was awesome and overwhelming, then it's quite hard to actually force a smile and to make yourself appear as quite happy and content and everything was okay, and make that actually appear as true to strangers. Joe Dillon really struggled to be able to act and to do that well to others. He had received a compensation award for the earlier bad injury from long ago. That injury that had progressively gotten a lot worse as the time had gone on. Yet he really wasn't sure how yet to spend that money. He was still too ill to really go off travelling far, to go off mega-loping to different mega mansions. He really just didn't know where to go either with it. Or he really wanted to do a tour of the rambling mansion himself, but he really didn't know where to go in it either. And he had a small room, so there wasn't really room to buy anything too large to store in his smaller room. Just enough for the things that he really needed to store under and over the bed. There were many drawers stacked high above the bed. There were 5 different levels that you could stack things on. He slept with the bed on level 3 in the middle. But there was the study desk underneath that, and above that there was another lounge area that he could rest out and spread around. And there was another area above his bed, a guest bed that could be used as, but sometimes he stacked and stored things on there also. And then all the other storage units on top, on the upper part of the stacking unit itself. So although it was a small room, it had 5 different levels to it at least, so that he slept in the mid-level of the bed itself. With 2 levels above and 2 below him, that he could stack and store lots of clothes, books, and various ornaments that he collected over the years within. Still, he was happy enough in a smaller room, and there was just enough room in there, a small table and chairs, and even a small, functional washing machine that still worked relatively well, and some drawers that stacked above the beds, that he could slide in different clothes, and it had enough room for out-of-season clothing, so there was more than enough space for one person. For a solitary room, it was really okay, in fact. There were much smaller rooms that really only had 2 stacked beds, and where you had to share those sometimes with others. So he was glad to have that really to himself. Really, though, there was no other space that he had to store rather than over and under the bed, so he was limited in the room in that sense. There was only the table and chairs area. Yes, there was a small washing machine that hummed, and even when it worked really well, in fact, the whole thing would vibrate and shake sometimes. But nevertheless, he used that also as a table, putting things on top of it, even though it shook slightly sometimes when it was on full spin. But still, there was very little other room. Sometimes he would have visitors, when they very rarely used to come, years ago, that could perch on top of the vibrating washing machine, and the other would sit on the spare chair, since there were only 2. Or someone would perch in the mid-part of the midsection of the bed stacks, and squeeze themselves in there. Though these days he had relatively few groups ever visiting him now then. He did spend lots of time, a few days out sometimes still, when he would visit some of the upper floors, viewing various upper galleries, and some of the others that he would visit on some of the middle floors too, some of the museums and art galleries. Yet he'd felt in a lot of pain travelling out with the injury. Even when he was wheeling himself out, it was difficult to do that too, and quite weary and faint with it also, so that he really wasn't really enjoying any of it. And so he really didn't want to carry on doing it, because he wasn't that emotionally stimulated by it either. Then, on a third attempt to do something more meaningful with the small visit he could do, and with a small sum of money, he'd gone up to escalate to level 50. On floor 50, where they had a bazaar, a giant sprawling market, the largest of the whole mega mansion. But actually it was a horizontal market that it connected to. It was a giant sprawling one. In fact, there was a labyrinth of shops in a number of larger giant halls, situated between floors 40 all the way up to floors 60, spread out over the 20 floors, that you could escalate up and down, so that it was both spread out, sprawling vertically, but also horizontally too. There were 20 flights up of markets to go up or down, and as many to descend as well, to reach the lower level of the giant markets. The market was a 3-dimensional marketing place, therefore, with the stalls stacked on top of each other, shops on top of shops on top of shops, and so on, with connecting escalators in between them. There were 4 of the major stairways escalating between the major marketing sections, but there were many other smaller stairways connecting some of the other levels too. The major stairways that were the giant 4 in the giant 4 corners of the commercial marketing district. They were really giant themselves, those 4 stairways. They were really wide and giant stairways that could really fit about a dozen people or so if lined up on one step. Walking in a line together, they could fit roughly a dozen or so people on each step. Unsteady people could stand on the inner side of the moving staircase so that they could hold on to something and hold on to each other. Those people that passed and wanted to go quicker would pass over on the outside, on the right side of the moving up or moving down escalators. People stood still on the left of the moving escalators and overtook on the right. Although they moved upwards or downwards slowly, and each step remained flat in its own self. It never shaked at all and remained steady and flat. People overtook on the outside, those in a rush, or those that merely were being held up by a group, by large groups that they wanted to get past, perhaps. Many groups huddled in close by on the left, holding on to the side or to each other. But it would move relatively slowly upwards anyway. Many were just happy just to be taken up slowly, carrying their many shopping bags up with them. The oldest recycling friend had visited one day. He'd met her at the factory. This particularly older recycling friend, her name was Molly Buttons. They began chatting. They chatted often, and they began chatting at the recycling factory, at the staff cafeteria. Molly Buttons was chatting to Jaden in the small, cramped staff cafeteria. She told him a long, rambled story, over many months, broken up into lots of different fragments. She told him of growing up in the large, chaotic family home, with her many different siblings, and then the nephews and nieces, and different cousins, all over the places, all emigrating to different floors, megaloping to different complexes. Only a few that she now saw regularly, only a few regular rooms and regular floors that she recognised. And then about her parents' arguments that had happened many years ago, her father's excessive drinking that had escalated, and occasionally become more violent towards the end, before it later de-escalated after the divorces. Until the later divorce, when they all got on finally afterwards, when they finally could live separate and moderate their relations better with each other. Seeing each other separately, they all got on so much well then. She'd really upset her mother, though, choosing to live with the father after the divorce. And Molly Buttons told Jaden she was upset about that for many years, but yet finally reconciled with her mother. Also upset with some of the brothers over the incident too. When she went to live with the father for many years and was out of contact for some time, even though he had moderated his drinking a lot after he'd stopped seeing the mother and stopped listening to her lies for so many years. Until he got the support to deal with things much more, and he'd escalated to having a new wife over the years too, who later sadly had passed on, and the father had gone back to drinking sometimes and being more melancholic sometimes, becoming more of a sad drunk though, but he never went back to being an angry drunk again. And besides, he'd never abused her, even when he'd been volatile, argumentative, and mentally straining with the mother, but never with her, and not even with the brothers, even though they'd taken offence to it more than her. No, with her, he'd been quite the opposite. Had been gentle, considerate, thoughtful, even long-suffering and patient with her, caring for her during the many difficulties of schooling for many years. Had spent a year or so caring deeply for her, especially when she herself had fallen so ill. Had persisted in caring and calling doctors. Was a good advocate for her when speaking to those doctors, and she had missed him greatly, dearly. He'd spoken to the teachers at school, where her grades had fell flat, and she was caught truant, had spent a lot of time researching schools, had his friends homeschooling her, albeit they weren't that well qualified in the experimental years, but trying his best to find as many suitable friends while he found a new school for her. Until finally, after many years' trips and trying out school visits, he'd found the right one and met the right school teachers too. One that could really thrive with her, without taunting her with loose names behind her back too often in those playgrounds. Calling her the short, fat, weird kid that was always said behind their back. No one ever spoke like that at the newer schools. She had comfort eaten, of course, through those earlier years, when stressed by the arguments and the unknown conditions. Yet she'd got that genetic condition, just like her mother, and the younger sister too, her older aunt. They were all larger sized, they could never have helped having those conditions. And why people taunted and mocked her for that, she'd no idea. But at the new school, She trained hard, had been able to work hard there, without any of the taunting. She could work hard, converting her short arms into muscly arms gradually over many years, working in many different jobs that were physically demanding, that had grown over the years when she was mothering herself and her husband, and then later her children, working and muscling up the arms when she was cooking, cleaning, washing, shopping for them, all that had kept her reasonably fit and hard, and training her up. Old Molly hadn't been so close to her mother for many years, who knew little about the name-calling, the teasing, felt she had been quite overbearing to her at home, demanded, expecting ridiculously high standards of all of the other children, kept the family home like a show house. Yes, it was very hygienic, always clean and very well kept, but discouraging the children's play within the house. If it moved anything, or if it caused any slight disruption in any way, and it always did, of course, playing games, then the mother didn't like anything done, especially any loud talk, loud music, anything. However happy it was, nothing. Not unnecessary talking. You had to have a very good reason to justify even talking quietly, unless there was an exceptionally good reason. So she'd spent many hours sitting there talking very quietly, whispering almost. She'd sat there for long times being silent, creeping around her own house, hushing, talking and creeping around eggshells, talking in hushed whispers to visiting friends, those that were still allowed to visit, reduced to sneaking out late at night, down to the park with friends, when she was rarely allowed to go to, even when she was able to get back after the early curfews, and one of the brothers used to let her in, opening the ground floor windows, or the ones that she could climb up to, the ones that she could sneak in from the forbidden evenings out, until the older brother had confessed, told all, sold her out to the mother, who'd seen the muddy footprints under the windows. Why hadn't she cleaned up when she'd been let in? Oh, well, it had been so late and so dark, and she'd been a little tired and drunk from the walks home sometimes, and just hadn't thought to on those occasions. So then, moving out of the family rooms with her father had been a release in a way, a liberation from those endless demanding chores of her mother, the demands for order and routine all the time, that regimental structure that she imposed on them all, her high hygienic expectations that filled every 3 hours, so it seemed, from the unending criticisms too, that Molly really didn't fit in with and was always getting wrong. She just didn't know how to speak correctly, or that her clothing just looked unsuitable, too scrappy, not tucked in enough, not stylish enough, never fitted in with the mother's views enough at all. Without usually telling her how to change the things, she often had to. She appreciated she'd still learn to cook, to clean, to wash, to shop, to budget well. She'd learn all those things from the mother well. Yes, the mother was well disciplined in many different fields, and she'd learnt those things well from the mother, and she did appreciate that. Had learnt a great many different skills from her, yet had little time to talk to her kindly, sensitively, about really emotional issues, what was going on with friends, and none of those things she could talk about. Was so busy with the older brothers, or arguing with the father sometimes, or really just doing her own housework herself, or going out visiting her own elderly parents, that she really had too little time for poor Molly Bottoms. And when she did really have time, occasionally, on those rarer times that the two of them had to talk together, old Mrs. Buttons didn't really know her daughter well then, had no idea that she'd been bullied at school at all, not for a year or so, nor that she'd even fallen out with the friends she used to go to the park with. Even her father didn't learn that until much later, when he and Molly had left the house together and when she'd opened up much more to him. Yet she continued to revisit the mother with strained visits until they gradually, years later, got on much better, and visited a few of the older brothers and a few of the sisters occasionally. That was all a long, long time ago, really, though, she told Jaden over the many months at work. Only one of the brothers now that she was in constant contact with only one that had actually passed on. But all the others had megaloped. They'd moved to different floors of the complex or different complexes of the island. Or they just moved to different rooms of the corridor. And many others had just moved on to different corridors of the actual apartments themselves.